Welcome everyone to Behind the CV, a series sponsored jointly by MindCore and CURF, the Center for Undergraduate Research and Fellowships, where we learn who faculty were before they became faculty and get a glimpse into their journeys beyond what you can learn from their websites or their CVs. We're delighted to be joined today by Dr. Elizabeth Zab Johnson, the Executive Director and Senior Fellow at the Wharton Neuroscience Institute. Welcome, Dr. Johnson. I will turn it over to you.
Great. We're actually an initiative, not an institute. That's a nuance, but that's fine. We're the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative. But I also came from an institute, so it gets very confusing sometimes. So yeah. So I'm happy to be here. It's a little bit weird for me to spend the better part of an hour talking about me. I'm usually focused on how I can help and be helpful to many other people. It may also be a little bit strange because technically I'm not faculty. So we can talk a little bit about the nuances of that, and because I think I sort of don't exactly fit a traditional model of what I do, but I do a lot of things that faculty do, and I do a lot of things that administrators do at academia. I don't technically have that title, at least at Penn. So yeah, I don't know how one usually starts, but I can sort of give a little bit of background about me. So my father is now an emeritus professor of engineering at Colorado State University. So I sort of grew up in an academic landscape, although I had no idea what he did as a professor. He never really talked much about it. All I knew is that he was very busy most of the time. It was only later on in my life that I started to even ask questions, or know to ask questions. And I don't think that my parents thought that I would be an academic, and they were certainly not trying to encourage me to go on and get a graduate degree, a PhD. So then I went to college. I went to Mount Holyoke College. It's an all-women's college, small liberal arts college in Western Massachusetts. I wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to be some kind of biologist, I thought, and I hated all the botany classes. I deeply despise them, which I'm sort of sorry about later on in my life, because I realized that I actually like gardening and I like thinking about plants. And now in retrospect, I think that came from a very youthful approach of thinking fundamentally that the biology of animals and humans was more interesting than the biology of plants. So what I did with that was that I tore through the course listings and tried to figure out how I could take as many biology classes as possible without taking any of the botany classes. And so that landed me in this hybrid of taking a combination of psychology and biology classes. Sort of back then it sort of predated that the college having a neuroscience program. So officially I studied psychobiology, which was not the biology of psychos, but instead was the biology that sort of at the time was much more interesting to me. And that really that circumstantial thing threw me into then a lifelong passion and love of neuroscience and a future in neuroscience, but it was completely arbitrary, and maybe if I had taken a fantastic botany class, I would be an entirely different kind of scientist, who knows? But I think about some of those happenstances. But I do think that it was a really critical part of my education to actually be surrounded by women at a fundamental young age, and to not do that too young. I think I had become pretty socially adept by not having a single-sex education prior to that. But there was something very critical about those first four fundamental years of my sort of early training as a scientist, where everybody that I saw, everybody that I interacted with, except for faculty, which were always mixed, were women, and that supportive environment where sort of defining who you are at a critical stage, long before you have to become a specialist. And I think a lot now about how fundamental that was to the trajectory of my life. In a very in a very critical way. And, not to like toot Mount Holyoke's horn too much, but, they've been the leader in sending more women to get science and engineering PhDs than any other school in the country for 50 years. And they have, over 100 years of history of having the most women that go into chemistry and physics. So really, sort of the hardest science. And it's a really small school. So that's numbers, not proportions of students. And so they are fundamentally, doing something, pretty extraordinary with early scientific training. And so I think a lot about that when I'm mentoring students now, whether they are men or they're women or others. But I do sort of always think back that was a really critical stage of building my own confidence in what I could do and my interests in what I could do. Then fast forward, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, of course, with the rest of whatever happens after college. And I was sort of interested in graduate school, but I was also interested in a lot of other things. So I applied for jobs and I applied to graduate school as a senior undergraduate. And I also applied for fellowships and to sort of cast a wide net, I guess, as it were. And I didn't get jobs, so that was interesting. That seemed to be a much harder fit, probably because I actually didn't have any real skills, and I was probably applying to the wrong jobs in a kind of the wrong way, in retrospect. But I did get into graduate school, and I did get an extraordinary opportunity to also study in Israel in a program that emphasized sort of leadership in democracies. And took Americans and Israelis and combined them together for a sort of a gap year in Israel. And so that was like also a passion point of mine. I really wanted that kind of experience. I was the only scientist, sort of scientifically trained person to be awarded that fellowship that particular year. And the funder of that program really like had a knack for picking really interesting students that came from lots of different backgrounds and sort of throwing them together in a real world sort of reality TV kind of way, and sort of saw what happened. Like, what happens if we put all these people that wouldn't necessarily all come together in a hotbed of political and sort of historical context and conflict. And the other thing that I think that was sort of unusual at the time with advanced hindsight, as I look back on my life, is that without even asking, so I knew I wanted to go to NYU for my PhD. I had gotten into NYU's neuroscience program. They had accepted me. I just told them I wasn't coming for a year. I never asked for a deferral. I never told them that I had this choice between these two different options. I just said, I'm going to come after a year. And they were like, okay, I guess that's okay. They'd never had something like that happen either. And I'm sure that like in retrospect, I realized like how much committees go through to sort of balance like the numbers of students that they're recruiting and how they're recruiting. Got all thrown off, from me being like naive enough to think that I could just demand that or say that, state that. But nevertheless, that's sort of what happened. So I marched off and I did my year in Israel, and then I came back. I sort of had this great gap year where I like was very sure about at least what the next few years of my life were going to be like. And I think that allows you to sort of embark on some things with confidence in a way that, like, if you're still very uncertain or you're still applying for things through that next year post-baccalaureate, it can be more complicated. So then I got my PhD at NYU, and that process took a little over 6 years. And then I was on a very traditional track. And thought I wanted to be a professor and in a very standard kind of environment, a research tiered caliber place. And so I did the next thing, which was to postdoc. And I moved to Duke University to be a postdoc. And that, that was going in also a very traditional kind of way, building on my skill set, learning a different technique that could expand my portfolio, all the things that, people were telling me to do. But I got embroiled in a project that was really hard, in a lab that that didn't necessarily have the same kind of approaches as my graduate lab had been. And so, the critical thing as a postdoc back then, but also now, right, is to publish, and to really show that you are more than your work with a graduate mentor, right? Because no matter how innovative and strategic your work is during your PhD, your graduate advisor usually gets lots of the credit, even if it has individually been, been driven by you. To some degree or to not, that has changed a little bit, but that's more or less the way that it is. And so your postdoc years are supposed to be spent, doing something that's different, but also a bit more, could be seen as being more independent. And I was doing that, but it was really hard. And it turned out that my postdoc advisor just had really deep rigor, and he was a fantastic graduate mentor, but he might not have been the best postdoctoral mentor because of the rigor that he demanded. So, right, and I don't necessarily mean that rigor is bad here, but what I mean is that there's this push and pull between what postdocs need to go into the academic landscape. And that's, to publish a lot and to feel like they're independent, but, to have the sort of flexibility and the mentoring that allows for that. And so what I ended up doing was sort of comparable to a second PhD project, right? And ended up with one paper, and it was a behemoth. It was the combination of all different kinds of techniques. It was, electrophysiology, and it was optical imaging, and it was 2-photon calcium imaging. I mean, it was crazy, actually. And it was a computational model all in one paper, right? And I think had the mentoring been a little bit different, and sort of focused on what the needs are of people that are going onto the job market, really what the right thing would have been for those to be 4 papers, right? And not seen as incremental pieces of that, but for substantial pieces of that. And on the one hand, it's a great, I think it's a great work. It's really comprehensive, but it's not necessarily the thing that like the traditional postdoc going into the academic landscape needs. So that was like one, I think, critical flaw, and I'm not, I can't certainly blame just my advisor for that. I fell right into that. I think that part of this is acknowledgement, right, of your own like sets of things, of not being able to see everything. But at the same time, I think I was still, competitive and on track to try and to take an academic position. I was just sort of fighting a little bit more on that uphill side of things because of some of those things that happen. But something else was happening in the background, which was that like maybe my second year of my postdoc, I went to a meeting of an organization that had recently formed, which was the Duke University Postdoc Association. And I talked out loud in that meeting. And so then I was given a title. That started off like being, I don't know, I don't even remember what my first official title was, but I think I was like event planning or, something around that. And so then I was like part of an organization sort of by default, just because I'd come to one meeting and spoken out loud. Then I became a much more active contributor in that organization as I landed on my feet. And then when the outgoing president was leaving to take her first faculty job, she said to me, I think you should be president of the organization. And there was like no democratic process. She just sort of handed it to me. And so I inherited that. which was odd all across the board. But these are things that happen. And so that was my third year of my postdoc, and that year, like early on in my presidency in the Postdoc Association, was when the rules, the sort of federal guidelines around private institutions and what NRSA recipients were eligible for with their stipends became much more complicated. In that the NIH's guidelines made people that had their own training fellowship no longer be employees of the university. So they were receiving a stipend that sort of excluded them from that. And it turned out that's really complicated, but and it doesn't happen in state universities the same way as it does in private institutions. But what was going to happen is that all of these postdocs that were like the shining stars, including myself, I had an NRSA, were going to lose their eligibility for the same kind of match to things like health benefits. And those were going to come out of the pool of money, that they gave, the sort of discretionary money that could be used for, research and supplies and travel, et cetera. And so it really penalized postdocs at a critical age. And I was fighting for the fact that women were particularly hard hit, especially those that had children already, right? And this was a part of your career trajectory where that was actually becoming more prevalent, and people were starting to have conversations about that. And like the worst thing that an institution or even the federal government could do, right, is penalize the stars, right? And people were starting to do that. They were actually turning down these fellowships because they didn't want to lose this eligibility. So it was doing the exact opposite thing that they really wanted to happen. So then I joined a sort of national force to talk about that. And, I talked to all kinds of people. I talked to the labor department, I talked to, because they didn't know, they were like, who are postdocs? We don't understand who these people are. And, I had to sort of tell them that it was because I knew who medical residents were. Like you see those people on TV, right? So, and they knew what all the other exempt categories were, but they had no idea what a postdoc was. They kept saying, well, they're students, they're fine. I'm like, no, they're not students, right? And it's just, and so I sort of labeled that sort of pocket of people, this invisible workforce. And it turned out that Duke didn't even know how many postdocs they had, right? There was like no mechanism by which they were counting us. So when I was on a task force at Duke, I would hear these wild numbers, like they're somewhere between 20 and 2,000. I was like, well, which one of those is it? That's like a radical difference. And what was interesting was that through that process, I actually saw behind the scenes in the university in a way that I had never experienced. I saw on the policy level, on the national level, and also on the NIH level, and I was starting to have those kinds of conversations. But a lot of what was happening was that I was actually seeing the internal mechanisms that devise policies within an academic institution. And I can't say that it was all awful. It was kind of fascinating to see that like one small thing was actually really much more complicated than people ever really talked about out loud, or maybe even knew, right? Until you got the right people in the room, right? So I had meetings with the provost and with payroll and with the health and benefits people and the health system, with the options for privatizing and taking postdocs out as like a union. I mean, all kinds of conversations were starting to happen, and it was really engaging, actually, in a whole different way. And it also sort of mattered a little bit more to me because I could see real lives being impacted. So I saw the sort of inner operations of a university and realized that there were all these layers, not necessarily of bureaucracy, but just of sort of fascinating things that help make things work and that get stuck when things don't work, right? And I started to think about that, but I also got to know a lot of people at the university. So the university became actually very small and sort of really intimate and close in a really interesting way, where it had been this gigantic sort of invisible thing that I didn't really spend a lot of time, I was mostly staring through a microscope, it's like the real difference was this macro versus micro perspective. So that was sort of unfolding at the same time, right as I was like getting myself onto the job market. And I had a baby, right? And that was my first baby, and I was, like months away from turning 35. And then it was interesting just to see like how that shifted what people expected of me, which is a whole different conversation. And then I was having interviews just like on the normal faculty job circuit. But at the same time, my postdoc advisor got offered to found this new thing, which was going to be called the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences. Actually, I helped to name it, and so it wasn't named that at the time. It had a much more clunky name. To start this organization that was sort of pan-wide, bringing neuroscience across campus, much in the way that MindCore is sort of working to do that in mind, brain, and cognition here at Penn. And his advice that he got from another person was that he had been on campus for a really long time, but he really didn't know how anything worked. He'd been in the School of Medicine. And so advice that he got was, you should bring onto the team someone who knows all the inner workings of the university. And he said that he thought, well, that's Zab, which was funny because, he knew that I was doing all this stuff, but then from the perspective of actually the university, they actually thought he was just trying to get a postdoc funded through another mechanism. So he knew why he was thinking about me from all the work, that I was sharing, that I was doing with the Postdoc Association and through this task force. But other people didn't. And of course, I did know way more about the inner workings of the university than he did. So that was interesting. So he gave me this opportunity to help build this thing from the ground up at a pretty critical point in time when I was trying to figure out what I really wanted to do. And at the time, I think what I thought was, well, I can try this thing. Like, when is this thing just landed in my lap? Like, this is kind of a special thing, like to be able to create and strategize and build a thing that doesn't exist, that connects what I love to like many aspects of the university. So if I spend a year doing this, I don't think anybody is going to penalize me for that. Like, I think I could probably go back. Like, I'm not shutting too many doors down. It's risky, but maybe not. And so that's what I went in to do. And I sort of agreed to do it, but it was very much on tentative terms. And part of that was just my own insecurity about like taking myself off that track and all the baggage that comes with that. Like, are you failing? My graduate advisor called me and told me that, that he didn't think I should be doing this, that I was super smart and that I had everything that it took to be, a regular professor. And that, that if it was any lack of confidence in my part, like that I should reconsider. And I think back on that conversation actually quite a lot, because I fast forwarded many, many years, and he actually apologized for having said that, because he said what I ended up doing was, creating this incredible opportunity for myself that, and that it was almost his own, academic chauvinism that there was like one way or the highway at the time, and that he should have acknowledged, right, that I could have different choices. But I still think that the fact that he called me, I think, was still really was great and supportive, right? So not to say that it was all doom and gloom at the time. I think that was kind of amazing, right? It showed that he cared. It showed that he thought I had what it took, and I think it's okay to have to ask people to justify some of their choices. So I did this thing. I created this thing that was called DIBS. as an acronym. And I did that for a number of years, and it was great. It was super fun. And it really, it really developed into something I think pretty special. And along that route, every opportunity that I found, I grabbed, right? So anytime that I felt sort of dissatisfied with the kind of work that I did, then I thought, well, there's always a way to create your own niche and to do the kinds of things that you're passionate about. And so that things didn't feel like a loss or that I settled or whatever. It actually felt invigorating and interesting and fascinating, like the whole time. And we grew from a really small operation where we had 3 people, and eventually, at the end of my time there, I managed a staff of 17. And it was a really big working operation. It really just had a lot of moving parts, but we also worked incredibly well together as a team. It was a really close family situation. People were really doing, I think, fantastic kinds of work. And in the middle of that, I negotiated to have a faculty appointment. So there are these, it was a research faculty appointment, not a tenure track, but that was fine to me. I actually didn't care about the tenure process or a tenure position. And I knew that I didn't fit the standard mold. But that became something that could be leveraged, right? Just because of the kind of work that I did and the kinds of things the opportunities that I was grabbing along the way. And part of that was that I was mentoring students. I was still involved in research, in my own research. I had a postdoc, like very standard things that are sort of fit that mold of faculty, while also doing this incredible creation and strategy for building this thing, this institute. And then the founding director left. He left rather rapidly. He became the director of another institute in Florida. And I said, under no certain circumstances was I ever going to move to Florida. so that he shouldn't even invite me. And he said, okay, I got it. And then we sort of began the search for another faculty director for the institute. And which was fine because, I could keep the shop running. It was, a large part, this is another conversation, but in large part, it was a lot of my own creation rather than a faculty director, asking me to implement things. And it turned out that the second director was Michael Platt. And he was already internal. He was already at Duke. And unbeknownst, actually, to the search committee and to the university administration, I had known Michael since I was a graduate student at NYU. So now we've known each other for 27 years. So that makes me feel incredibly old. But he was starting as a new postdoc at NYU when I was starting as a graduate student. So we sort of grew up together as neuroscientists, it turns out. And our respective spouses actually went to high school together. So, and they didn't know that until we went over to their house when I was being recruited as a postdoc for dinner, and we walked in and Liz looked at Shad and there was this aha moment. So they go back even further, actually, which is sort of, a weird intertwining kismet of, combination. But Michael and I did really different science. So we were friends, but we weren't close. But we had never worked together. And through all of that process, but suddenly we started working together, right? And I was the associate director for the institute, and now he became the director. And we had this opportunity to do this stuff together. And I think there was something really critical about the fact that we trusted each other and had grown up in science together, and had all this background that allowed us to really do things that I couldn't have done with the founding director, because there had always been this social hierarchy, right? I had been his postdoc, I'd sort of grown up, but this was sort of more of a peer, but he sort of we mutual respect of each other's science and skill sets and differences and all the rest. And so that's, so I think we those last few years where we worked together at Duke were just some of the most innovative stuff because of that. Don't disregard the kinds of amazing synergies that you can have with just the right collaborators, right? Whether that's one individual or many, I think, science is way underpowered if you don't acknowledge the aspects of how it can flourish together, right? How it can be different than just the sum of the parts. The whole can definitely be greater in that kind of situation. And I think that's what we found ourselves in. And I think we both really enjoyed it. And then fast forward, and he got recruited, of course, away to Penn. And I told him, that I would consider Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, unlike Florida. But I also just really loved working with him and some of the freedoms that enabled. And he said, give me a little bit of time at Penn to figure out what we could do there. And that will allow me to sort of get on the ground and see what's possible and all, but yeah, let's keep talking. And so that's in large part what happened. And so, there were some other things that happened. We can talk about that if people want to, but at Duke, when I had been left without the main supporter, that's another kind of conversation. It's just, in full summary, they made it really easy for me to leave. So that's another part of those kinds of partnerships, right? Where you don't necessarily have the same leverage. The institution never loves you back, no matter who you are, whether you're traditional faculty or administration or the president even, right? You have to acknowledge that there's sort of less knowledge about what you do and what you bring to the table, and then you're inherently about yourself. So there's always going to be some of that. But during that year, this thing sort of evolved that would become what is the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative, and this partnership with Wharton, and bringing neuroscience now into one of the top business schools and one of the best universities in the country. And I think at that point it was a really interesting phase for me, because I had built this thing where it had been very inwardly focused, like very academically focused, like how do we bring different people into dialogue about how neuroscience can touch the humanities and to law and the arts and engineering and all the traditional kinds of arts and sciences dialogues, and beyond that. But I was ready for another challenge, which is like, how do you bring neuroscience to society at large? And it was really empowering to do that through business, right? Because that's the vast majority of the rest of the outside world. And I couldn't have done that actually in a very academic institute, just because the connections aren't there. The knowledge base isn't there. And Duke had a business school, but we were just a little piece of the puzzle trying to fit that together. I think the endorsement of saying, planting a flag and saying, yes, Wharton is going to have neuroscience and thinks of neuroscience as being key to how businesses operate and how people, function, is different, is a little bit of a different focus. And that allows us to sort of connect, not just with business people, but with all different kinds of organizations, inside and outside, still do all of the interconnecting that I still have a deep passion for around multidisciplinary dialogues and bringing interesting collaborative academic researchers together, but also this other impact of like, what are the limitations? How can we break out of just doing lab research that matters to a very small number of people, bringing that out into the wild, testing it, seeing where it breaks, what's feasible, what's not feasible, how can we impact lives and policy and make it relevant for people. And really that's in large part, that's what I do now, through the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative is to try to do that. And I feel a deep obligation to do this because fundamentally taxpayers are paying for all, of scientific inquiry. And the average person doesn't know or want to know why it matters to them. But everyone has one of these, 2 to 3 pound organs in their heads, and they're doing lots of complex things with them. And organizations are built by, the work that all those people carrying around the 2 to 3 pound organ in their heads are doing. And so it should matter. So the neuroscience should matter. But it doesn't mean that everybody needs to understand all the neuroscience. It just needs to be made relevant. And if we do that well, then I think that we're building these bridges of support for why we are part of a scientific discovery process, why higher education matters, why multidisciplinary collaborations can be so transformative and do such impactful work that can really change society and give us hope. And so that's in large part my own passion point, right? And I love that I get to strategize and create and think about novel ways of doing that. And I love that, that my job also allows for me to do all the things that don't feel like I gave up a traditional track. I designed and I co-instruct a class in Wharton that I would never have dreamed of before, but it's super fun. So I teach a visual marketing class. I teach everything about, visual neuroscience and that what people need to know to think about optimizing for how people take in visual information. I don't teach the marketing part. That's taught by a marketing professor. But we created this course, and it's sort of this confluence, right, of things that can be combined. I still mentor research. I feel very strongly that I love to watch the growth and development of young minds, whether or not they go on to become scientists. I want them to know how to ask questions and to be curious. And to write well, right, and to hypothesize and all of those things. And so mentoring undergraduate students is one of the most rewarding things that I get to do. But I don't fit into these traditional boxes and buckets, and so it makes it really hard for people to ask me. They always wonder, what do I do? Is it everything from, am I married to Michael Platt? I get that also. And it doesn't help that his wife is an Elizabeth as well, right? And an academic to boot. To thinking that that I'm like a glorified lab manager. And it's really hard to sort of say I do that, but I also do this thing. But people are like, oh, are you, so you're, no, I'm not, technically I'm not faculty. Actually, I'm still faculty because I'm an adjunct at Duke still. But Penn has more rigorous rules around and non-tenure track appointments. But they gave me an appointment so that I can be an instructor. It's just very complicated. So, but I think that that's the other, sort of message, is that you can create inside and outside of academia. And that a job description should not hold you back, and that you can continually, I think, push on the boundaries. And just because there's some rules that you think that you have to follow, I think that if people see that there's value, and you find that there's value in the kinds of initiatives that you want to take, I think there's a great amount of opportunity actually to seize. Outside of the traditional lens of being, of doing any kind of work. And I think that the real limitation is in, is what you yourself want to push yourself to do. That's at least what I've found. But I was incredibly fortunate, right, to have these opportunities, literally sort of just happen the way that they did. But I think that there is a lot of that. People are willing to be supportive, networking, people to help you find others and to find opportunities and creative strategies. You sometimes just have to be able to push through and look in new kinds of ways. So, all right, that's way too much talking for me, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. This was really, really interesting hearing about your trajectory and kind of the unique, multiple different roles you've carved out for yourself. I I noticed a few themes in your story, one about kind of community and culture, both in places you chose, starting with Mount Holyoke and how that really shaped you, the culture there, and being in a single-sex environment as a college student, and also kind of the culture in other places you ended up, and how that, created opportunities or maybe pushed you a little to leave an institution. So I thought that was really interesting. I have several questions, but I want to open it up to others first. So I'll give anyone else a chance. You might have a burning question, and if not, I'll throw you one of mine. So if anyone wants to, we're such a small group, feel free to just unmute yourself and go ahead. I am just going to ask you, since you do have a unique role, that you, as you alluded to, you're sort of faculty, sort of not, you have these administrative roles, you mentor researchers. Can you talk a little bit about how you balance all of those roles and whether that's changed over time, like gotten easier? How do you handle juggling all those different roles?
Yeah, it's a lot. I think that's a good question. I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. We used to have these conversations always because, in the School of Medicine, you have all this effort reporting that you have to do. And I always think about the fact that like some people's 100% effort is different. Like if I'm, if I'm thinking about a project while I'm in the shower, like maybe the visuals aren't the right one here, but like, is that different from like someone who just takes a shower, right? Like that's like, the sort of shower test kind of notion of effort. So I think there's a little part of my brain that's thinking about this stuff all the time. And that's because I really love it. I love the work that I do. I love spending time on thinking about that. I also know that there are just times when you have to get other things done, right? So I get a lot of questions about how you juggle, like how do you juggle these kinds of things. And I said, like first and foremost, I'm the executive director for the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative. So that means if there's a critical thing that we're working on, whether that's a report or, a fundraising event or, whatever it happens to be, I have to do that, right? Like that's pure and simple. And so the other parts of me have to sort of come in those liminal spaces in between. And so that might mean that I have some late nights or some early mornings in order to get all that done. And I think it's the same, when you're mentoring a student and they don't get their writing to you until the last minute, but they really need your feedback. You sort of have to figure out like, how am I gonna do what that student really needs me to do while I also accomplish all of my things on my to-do list. And so, you always have to juggle, I think, what you're doing. And it's the same, when you're teaching, like those are locked in schedulable hours that that to anticipate. Lots of things have become I've learned to become much more efficient, right? So the other things that used to, create lots of bottlenecks for me were like, I would overthink every lecture, right? I would over prepare when I was beginning to teach. And now I realize that that you can continually iterate, right? You should just and you can throw out everything and start all over again. But if you are going to do that, then you better save the time to be able to do that. So there's no magic answer. It's always this delicate balance. I don't sleep very much, so that's one thing. I never have. So I'm up quite early in the morning, and I get some kinds of work done then that's different. Like nowadays, Michael Platt and he's also an early riser. We do a lot of texting back and forth with which other people are like horrified by. You what? Like he's your boss and you're texting him at 5 a.m. I'm like, we're both awake. And we also know that we have consolidated time to strategize about certain things that I would never be able to interrupt him or me during the rest of the day. So there are just these pockets. There's sort of these pockets of time that get worked out, but probably it helps that I don't need a whole lot of sleep.
It's kind of funny, like you think of faculty life as being like that, and it's like, oh, maybe just life is like that.
Life is just like that.
think it's also, a great sign that you're like passionate enough about what you're doing, that you're thinking about it all the time, and that's what you want to be doing at 5 o'clock in the morning. So maybe that's just like you found the right thing. I'm kind of curious. I mean, I think something that's like very vague to me, and I could also just do like work about this, it's just about how a center works and like what the scope of your job and that sort of administrative and coordinating people and strategizing. Like, can you talk a little more about that side of things outside of like the mentorship and teaching?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, that also has lots of different moving parts to it, right? So there's always, when you grow something from the ground up, right? There's essentially this, like, there's these startup phases where you're building sort of both an internal and an external view of what this thing is. It's like traditional, like branding kinds of efforts and communication strategies around messaging, whoever that audience is. So I do a lot of that kind of generative writing and sort of development. It was all of my efforts to get a website up and running, and all sort of behind the scenes of how that should be architected to convey the right kinds of messages, to working with the development team, right, to build cases for why you need support and why there should be ongoing fundraising efforts made, because that's perpetually a thing with centers, right, is that they're never guaranteed, and they're never perpetual, which that uncertainty sometimes terrifies certain kinds of people. But at this point in my life, I just think it's just par for the course for an effort that you build. And yeah, probably the psychology department is never going away, but research centers are quite different. And so if you work for one, you just have to realize that, like, there is a sense of impermanence. And so a lot of what you do is work to try to make it more stable, right? So that's in building metrics that are visible, event programming, bringing people together, making sure that there are successful collaborations that have returns on investment that can be demonstrated. Whether or not you are applying for external grant support, right, to help through that, or helping to shepherd some of that to these sort of discrete sort of fundraising efforts. And I think Heather is, I'm watching Heather nod, and I know that that's in large part like what that kind of administrative job is. In large part, it's just to sort of make sure that the things that you're doing matter, and that can be on a very small scale, and it can be on a very grand scale, right? And you are usually juggling a bunch of those kinds of things all at once. So there's lots of email, there's lots of correspondence that you have to do. There's lots of meetings that you end up having to help facilitate those kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, it is sort of murky. And when people ask me, like, how do I spend my days, 9 to 5 or whatever, I'm like, I don't know. Like, I really like doing all of that, right? In between managing, staff to make sure that the things that, that get done. And they're, I keep very organized. I have to be very organized because there's always a lot of things that are going on. So you sort of have these ideas of what you're projecting, like when things are coming, when are things really going to be on a critical stage? What are the absolute deadlines you're working with? Which things are flexible? If you need to make things more flexible, have you corresponded with the right people around doing that, and then put into place that those things are, being worked on? All of those things are happening all at once. And one of the things that I said was that I managed a staff of 17. Well, I managed a staff of 1 at Penn. So in some ways, people also asked me, like, was that weird, to sort of like almost like a Groundhog Day kind of phenomena. But the institutions are actually quite different. And so Penn is decentralized, but there are enough things that are actually centralized that come in as like core like components, and Wharton for sure has more of this included, right? So at Wharton, there's like a marketing and communications office. So I don't have to do all the infrastructure support of a website, but I am in the background of the content management system. I know how it operates. I know when it's broken, but I don't necessarily have to like find an independent contractor, right, to help me with some of that. And you know, and they can and do help with campaigns, like other kinds of messaging and through facilitated kinds of core things. We have this amazing resource called the Wharton Behavioral Lab here, which is sort of a core, you know, which is a core research operation that now includes neuroscience technologies for human subjects research. And so it's almost like I have a research team poised to help with some kinds of, you know, subject recruitments. We don't have to do that as a cottage industry. So while, you know, so I interface actually with a lot of people, and in some ways, like I have these transient management jobs of, you know, what would be a much larger team. But my, you know, my direct report now is one instead of 17. But the complexity, you know, and sometimes we can't do those things because those people are also shared by lots of other people, and so they're doing other work. Or that, you know, at Duke they were all my dedicated staff. But you just sort of learn how to deal with it. So it's not like the whole thing shrank, right? There is actually much more consistency, even though the operations seem quite different.
Well, we're coming up on 5 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of your time. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I feel like this was a great peek, not just behind the CV, but kind of behind the institution or the initiative, to kind of learn a little bit more about the inner workings of both the university and different centers. So thank you again for joining us. This was really delightful.
Thank you.